welcome to today's ELT CPD podcast and the second in our mini-series on diversity and inclusion. Today we'll be talking specifically about race and ethnicity with our expert James Warwick. Hi James, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks so much for coming on the show today. We're really excited to hear what you've got to say about race and ethnicity in publishing.
Yeah, no problem. Excited to be here.
So maybe let's start just by you telling us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm a digital product manager at the moment for Pearson. I was formerly a content developer or content creation specialist. And in both of these roles, I hire writers and editors. And in my current role, I conceptualise digital applications for English language learners.
Perfect. So you come across sort of freelance writers and editors quite often, would you say, in your job at the moment, or?
Yeah. I mean, we're in a process of finding and developing new projects. So yeah, I'm always looking out.
Perfect. Okay, so today we're talking about diversity and inclusion in ELT publishing, so specifically race and ethnicity. So what do you think are some of the biggest issues and challenges to overcome in publishing at the moment related to this?
Well, in the field of ELT publishing, I think ELT publishing has often been seen as quite an ivory tower profession where only a few select teachers make it into writing or editing, and very few make it to the inner sanctum of this ivory tower where they're actually working in-house and have the ability to commission teachers. At least when I was first starting out, I found it very, very difficult to enter into the profession. And it wasn't necessarily an issue of race. It seemed as though it was locked off and guarded to people who weren't already in that profession of writing and editing. So there were and are still, I think, serious barriers to entry, especially for teachers who may not have had that experience and maybe from a different culture or background. Where their immediate surroundings don't provide them that level of experience.
So you started out as a teacher then in ELT?
Yeah, I was a teacher for 6 years.
And what barriers did you find? Did you find that it was difficult to break into publishing, or what were the steps that you took to get into that?
So publishing was the real kind of barrier. Entering teaching, we all have the same qualifications, the CELTA or Delta. That was fine, and I could find a job relatively easily. It was mainly when I was trying to make that transition from teacher to working in-house as an editor that I found most difficult.
It's interesting you say that, because it makes me wonder if there's teachers who also feel the same, that there's barriers of going from a teacher to publishing. So you work with lots of freelance writers and editors, as you said, in your position in Pearson. So how do you think we can encourage writers specifically to use more inclusive practices in their materials writing? Are there any things that you think they should consider, for example?
So this was an interesting one. I've spent the last year and a half now developing these set of guidelines for Pearson, and they are called the Race Ethnicity Guidelines. I worked with a fantastic team led by Adika Chegua, and we developed a set of principles to help facilitate authors in their selection of materials, whether that's images or texts. And the four main principles behind it were, firstly, underrepresentation, which is perhaps the most obvious one, limited positive associations, missing stories, and finally the problem frame. And so those are foundational to ensuring that we represent all diverse communities and cultures in ELT materials, as we often kind of skew very Eurocentric in the stuff that we publish currently.
So it's really interesting. So a couple of things. So firstly, the guidelines that you mentioned, are they sort of publicly available, or are they just in-house at the moment? So I think people will be really interested to hear more about that.
Yeah, so they are currently in the final stages of development. I feel like I've talked about them for a while. They're in the final stages of development, and they will be published Q1 2021. So they will come out this year alongside Pearson's other guidelines around the women in leadership guidelines, which is around gender equality, also the ABLE guidelines, which are around disability and spectrum, which are releasing their own guidelines around LGBTQ plus equality. So it's all going to be very neatly packaged into this new editorial policy that's coming out this year.
Perfect. I think it's really, really essential that every freelancer you work with has access to those. I think that would be really important when they are released and shared widely. So let's go back to the 4 points that you mentioned. Maybe
Sure.
you can explain what's meant by each term, maybe give some examples and just elaborate a little bit more. So firstly, underrepresentation. What do you mean by that specifically?
So underrepresentation is the obvious. I mean, if you flick through a book and there are no diverse faces, and by diverse I don't just mean black, I mean Indian, South Asian, if there's no diversity on the surface from a visual level, at least with the images, then you know that there's a level of underrepresentation, especially in an ELT book. But going beyond that is really where teachers and writers need to start, critically evaluating their material. Have they chosen sources for their reading texts that are diverse, feature diverse characters, come from different cultural perspectives? Underrepresentation is not just images and throwing a few black and white and Chinese and Asian images in there. It's around critically evaluating the materials that you're choosing in your writing to reflect a culture or series of cultures that are different to your own perspective. And the evaluation process of doing that is what we want to start getting into the habit of.
Do you think maybe there's a challenge because ELT might be a lot of teachers might be based in Australia, the USA, England, for example, and maybe some of the sources that people are using, maybe they don't have access or don't know where to find those things? Could that be one of the issues as well, maybe?
Could be. And I mean, it's not really... I'm not saying that this is anyone's fault. I'm just highlighting the current state of affairs. If it requires a little bit more work to look at and find and really analyse whether this text is appropriate, they should get into the habit of doing that, so that we're not just so Eurocentric or America-centric or Australia-centric. We just need to start opening our worldview a bit. And I know teachers and I know writers who are currently doing this and doing some great work, but I think that on a kind of within the industry itself, if we could get into this habit, that would be fantastic.
Perfect. Let's move on to the next point that you mentioned. So limited positive associations. So what do you mean by that?
So what often happens in ELT, and not just ELT but publishing more broadly, is that we start to attach ourselves to a few good instances of diverse achievement. So we may talk about the Serena Williams, or we may talk about the Sundar Pichais, or we may kind of attach ourselves to this ideal of what a certain person from a certain background is capable of. We may think that someone who is black is more athletic, or someone who is Asian is more technology focused and driven. But what you need to realize is that by showing those let's not call them representative, but those kind of people in that context, you are limiting a child or an adult's view of what they can achieve in society. Their perspective is narrowed to becoming Usain Bolt, Serena Williams, or an actor or a musician. There need to be more representative examples in science, in other kind of STEM subjects or academic subjects. Not just this is not just an issue with race and ethnicity. This is a broader D&I diversity issue. Limited positive associations is the kind of flip side to underrepresentation. You're showing representation, but in a very, very narrow frame.
100%, and I really think that's something writers, editors, anyone that works in publishing maybe hasn't considered. As you said, they think about the underrepresentation, but not the flip side. You gave some really good examples there. Missing stories, what do you mean by this?
So missing stories is a case where you're reporting on an event. We often use Dunkirk as an example in-house for training purposes, but if you're reporting on an event or a historical moment in time regarding kind of the British Empire or American prosperity, there are often untold stories that are underneath the kind of prosperity in Glasgow, the prosperity in London, the Virginia. There are places where slaves were integral to the contribution of that economic growth. So this is not just applicable within ELT. It's applicable in history, sociology, and psychology, and a whole gamut of textbooks. But within the context of ELT, it does mean just ensure that when you're writing about a text with a level of historical accuracy, you're considering all angles of that text. So, we're very often, as writers, I know you're very often told to choose real text, find real, authentic texts that are engaging. Fine, do that, but then also think about what are the other perspectives? Where are the missing stories here? Are there any missing stories here? If there aren't, that's fine, but it's something to consider.
And how would writers go about that? Because I'm just thinking of it from their point of view. For example, say, let's use your Dunkirk example. If writers were to talk about sort of slaves being instrumental in something, do you think publishing companies would, I don't want to sort of put them all in the same, tar them with the same brush, but do you think they would go for that? Or do you think they'd say, oh, that's maybe not appropriate, or that's, how do you think that would be taken? Yeah,
it's a good point. I don't think, there's a couple of taboo subjects within ELT, and they may think this is to the line, but I think that it's still worth mentioning in the context what the real history was. So for instance, in Dunkirk, there were loads of Indian soldiers who came from the British Empire to assist in that battle. All that needs to happen is a brief mention of the fact that this was the case, or an image of those soldiers. So images are a big issue, but also the reference in that text of contributions of people who are from different backgrounds would also be a good start.
Maybe the media misses these stories completely. It's quite prevalent in the media, sort of film, TV, things like that, newspapers. So say a writer were to look for an article online, maybe the media wouldn't include something like that. So where would they even go to sort of find out the real history and those missing stories?
It just requires a bit of digging. I mean, I can't get asked you to skew one way or the other in terms of political leanings, but I know that The Guardian, for instance, has a few good kind of in-depth articles around history, British history, colonial history, that you can really look at, and I know they're freely available in other places online as well. So you can, if you want to research an event, a historical event or period, you can easily do that online and find some more in-depth articles around it.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, and finally, the fourth point that you mentioned was the problem frame. So if you could just elaborate on this, if you've got any examples, maybe.
So the problem frame is around how certain cultures and certain disadvantaged people from different backgrounds are boxed into becoming helpless. They're perceived as victims. They are often talked about as degrading the cultural and societal value. This can be in ghettos or in urban centres, or you use certain loaded language to talk about people from these backgrounds that everyone knows there is a negative connotation to it. This could have been exacerbated by the media previously, or it could be a new connotation that has sprung up that frames people in a certain way as detrimental to society as a whole and as helpless victims who aren't able to overcome their own it could be either their own intellectual capacity to do something, or are unable to get out of their own disadvantage.
Okay, let's talk about publishing companies. So many publishing companies do have a severe lack of diversity, and today I was reading and I saw quite a few comments on a post from a smaller publishing company. They sort of posted a picture of all of their writers, and there was a lack of representation in their author pool as well. And I think they were sort of thinking about it from another point of view as well that maybe they hadn't considered. What do you think companies can do, so publishing companies, just to build a more diverse and representative author pool?
So this is an interesting one, and I know that within Pearson we've conducted a survey with all of our authors and editors and contributors to find out more around where they come from, what their orientation is, whether they are disabled, or what their race and ethnicity is. And the reason we're doing this is so that we can find out where there's more work to be done. And I think it's incumbent on all of the publishing companies to look at who they're hiring. Often they are friends of a publisher, or friends of an editor, or friends of someone who's just joined the company. And this closed circle is really what makes it difficult for people who are non-native or may not have interacted with this small social circle to actually enter the industry. It's not that they're any worse or better than people who are friends of publishers or friends of editors. It is that there is no ladder of access being provided to people who are non-native teachers or who are teachers who weren't within the proximity of that rising star publisher when they first joined the industry. This is this kind of close-knit circle of depending on people who you know and who you like is really endemic within ELT. So there needs to be a wider net cast to be able to actually send out, get solicitations from authors from a wide range of backgrounds internationally who are teachers, who are maybe first-time writers, so that we can provide that initial access for them to join and we can nurture talent as publishers. That is something that we should be doing.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think, as you said, if you're not in that network, I mean, how can teachers maybe from international environments, maybe like a teacher from Brazil, for example, would it be more likely that if they wanted to get into writing, they'd have to apply only to their branch in their company, if a publishing company had like a branch in Brazil, for example, or could they write for an international audience? Because I know you have sort of localized course books, so...
Yeah, and this is part of the problem. Some of the best teachers that I ever taught alongside were, well, there was one who was Brazilian and she was absolutely incredible. The opportunity for that teacher being from Brazil and going back to Brazil and teaching in Brazil, the opportunity there is narrower. It seems as though local publishers tap into their local resource of ELT teachers, and those are the people who are kind of given the opportunity to produce textbooks for their local audience, so secondary or primary textbooks. But there is top tier talent there. There's top talent within those geographies. So the central organisation, if your organisation is this big and is structured this way, the central organisation, whether that's in the UK or the US, needs to be able to tap into that talent that is available at those local levels. They may have market-specific knowledge, which is fantastic, but they also have general knowledge of how to write ELT materials. So tapping into that knowledge, developing those that talent from the writers and from the editors in those geographies is huge. I mean, that's a huge missed opportunity. So yes, if your business is that large, you can start to do that. If your business is smaller, then you can send out application forms online. Use online as your primary recruitment tool for authors and editors. Look at publications, look at who has been published that is an author in a local geography, or someone who is doing a great job that you might want to recruit. So there are plenty of ways, and I refuse to believe that companies can't do this. There are so many ways that they can.
Do you think it's more of an active thing that the publishing company has to do rather than the teacher going into writing, seeking out that opportunity?
I think so, but it's no
publishers?
more active than what they're currently doing. They just need to, I know they receive proposals and they go with those proposals, but it's no more active than nurturing the next generation of talent. I mean, once the authors and editors that they work with currently want to retire or want to leave the industry, where is that next level of talent coming from? Where are the younger authors? Where are the authors from different backgrounds? So it's just a progression. So it shouldn't be that difficult for them to be able to just reach out and recruit those from different cultural backgrounds or younger authors or younger editors to be able to diversify the industry a bit.
Perfect, yeah, definitely. So we have a question from a listener now that was sent in. So how can writers and publishers realistically find out if materials are sensitive but also confront real issues?
So I mean, there's the standard parsnip stuff, political, alcohol, religion, etc., that they were not allowed to use as publishers. I think this was probably set as a standard way back when. But, sensitivity is subjective. So I think we have a set of kind of rules and guidelines in our editorial policy, at least within Pearson, and I'm sure other companies have the same standards. I think it just requires a real look at where the world is currently. So where do we fall on a global spectrum? Where do we fall in a local political spectrum? Are there countries that ban certain activities that are illegal? Are they being decriminalised? What are the barriers that exist within those markets that you intend to publish in? If you're intending it for a UK audience, there's more you could probably get away with. If you're intending it for a Saudi Arabia or Chinese audience, or any audience where there are more stringent laws as they relate to diversity and EDI, then you're going to need to take that into consideration, because the book still has to sell. But there needs to be, companies need to make a global stance and then adapt for a local audience.
So obviously there are localised course books which cater to the needs of specific geographies, but maybe don't take a more global D&I stance. So do you think these will always be a thing, or?
I don't know. I mean, I can't speak to the future of ELT, but I know that in my current role, more and more ELT teaching is becoming digitised, and there's different ways of online teaching. So I don't know whether they'll be localised as such, but I think that having one singular online version, like Udemy, Coursera, and our English.com kind of platforms, are potentially the way that we're going to go. And we're going to go to a singular course-based system where if people want to buy into those courses, then they can. But we've taken a global DEI stance on those courses.
Okay, so just a final question, again, another question from a listener. Is there anything that people that work in ELT, whether it's publishing in-house or whether it's teachers or writers or editors, can do to sort of further research this if they're interested, or to learn more themselves about race and ethnicity in publishing?
Yeah, so there are two things that are happening this year, early this year. The first is a launch of the Race and Ethnicity Guidelines in and of themselves, which will be publicised on Pearson.com, I think, Pearson's website, that will offer kind of further reading on race and ethnicity guidelines. There's also the editorial policy that I mentioned that's coming out this year. But it really starts with looking at those topics that I mentioned earlier and looking at the content that you've written and thinking, does the content that I've written as a holistic piece of writing, whether it's a course book, a workbook, whatever it is, does what I've written abide by the principles that I've mentioned: underrepresentation, limited positive association, missing stories, and the problem frame? Doing a content audit on yourself of a previous piece of work that you've written is always a good place to start. I think once you've done that, once you've assessed, how am I writing content? Who am I including in those images? Who am I including in the texts? Doing that initial piece of work will help you then become a better writer.
So thanks so much for being on the show today, James. I think you've really touched on some good points, and I think we can get together sort of a blog post or just some more information that we can post for writers and publishing companies to consider the points that you mentioned.
Brilliant.
So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
So thanks so much to James for being on the show today to talk about race and ethnicity in ELT publishing, and to you guys for sending in your questions. The final podcast in this mini-series on diversity and inclusion will be next month, so do send any questions you have into info@eltcpd.com. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Bye.